Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Wallaby webinar. My name is Simon McKinley. I work at Wallaby. I've been at Wallaby for a few years now. I'm going to be speaking and demoing today. And along with us today, we also have Artem Govorov, our CEO and founder, and he's going to be doing the real-time Q&A and chat. So if you've got any questions throughout the presentation, please ask and we'll get back to you as we proceed. So a little bit of history about Wallaby before we get started. So Wallaby was founded in 2015 on the Gold Coast in Australia. And we started with a single product, Wallaby.js for JetBrains editors. We now have two main products, Wallaby and Quokka.js. And for both of those products, we provide support over 5 separate editors, so VS Code, JetBrains, Visual Studio, Atom, and Sublime Text. So there's a total of 9 separate products that we're actively maintaining for Wallaby and Quokka. We also have a smaller open source project that we created really for ourselves, but we're hoping that the community finds that useful also. It's called Dingo. It's an extension for VS Code for quickly cloning and installing packages for JavaScript, TypeScript repos. So you can find out a little bit more about Dingo on our websites. Our mission as a company is to create awesome tools for software developers. As a team, we've been doing that for a number of years, well before Wallaby came into existence. Artem and I and some of the other team were working together since 2012, and all of us have a background in creating software development tools for software developers. So that's what excites us. That's what we love doing, and we're lucky enough to be able to apply our passion and create tools for other people. A quick quiz of the day. Some people may not know about our product names and where they come from, but what do these animals have in common? They're all Australian native animals. So up the top here, you have the wallaby. It's like a mini kangaroo, if you like. Down the bottom on the right-hand side, you have a quokka. Quokka is also a native animal to Western Australia. We have a dingo, which is a native canine, so not a domesticatable canine, so you wouldn't have them as a pet. And then we have a couple of other animals that we're considering for some of our future product initiatives. We have boobook owl, and we have the numbat marsupial. So we've chosen to name our products after Australian native wildlife. I'm going to do a little bit of go back to basics a little bit, because I know that we may have some people on the webinar today that may not have seen Wallaby before. We saw a couple of registrations come through from people who were new to Wallaby. So very high level, we're going to give a bit of a demonstration of Wallaby before we dig into some of the features and go through the feature demonstrations. So what is Wallaby? Wallaby is a developer productivity tool. It runs in your editor, and it shows the results of your tests as you are typing. So it highlights the results of your tests, shows you what's passing, what's failing, what errors you might have in your editor, in your code window, right next to the code that you're writing. Unlike the normal, if you're running tests outside of your editor, you might be running from the command line. And if you're lucky, the command line supports some sort of watch mode. And so as you save a file, your tests are going to run, and then you have to try and work out what's happened to your tests, what's passing, what's failing. So Wallaby's doing all of that for you. It runs immediately on your code as you type, so you don't have to save a file for Wallaby to start running. It also knows about your tests and how they relate to your code. And so it will run the tests that are affected by your code change. That means if you're editing a test right now, it's smart enough to know I'm only going to run that particular test that I'm editing right now. It also knows if you are editing a piece of code that might be used by 5 different tests, then it will run the 5 different tests as you edit that code. I'm going to jump into a quick demonstration now. Again, this is really for beginners on the call, just to show you what Wallaby looks like and talk through some of the basics. So when you first, I've got a little project here, a calculator sample project. It's pretty basic. I have a single dependency, which is Jest, which is a popular testing framework. and I have a very simple JS configuration that's just saying I'm going to use Node to run these tests. And then I have a calculator with a few methods on it. And I have a test file for that calculator class. I import the calculator and I have some basic tests. So after installing Wallaby, to get started, for 70 to 80% of projects, you don't have to do anything special. You can start straight away. So what does that look like? I can bring up my VS Code command palette and say Wallaby.js start. You can see there's a hotkey for that. And when I start Wallaby, you see down in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a little progress indicator that comes from Wallaby saying that it's running a test right now. And when it's finished running your test, it will show you a cross if you've got any failing tests and the number of tests that are failing, and a tick and the number of passing tests. So the tick means passing, the cross means failing. And if you click on this status indicator, you'll bring up the Wallaby test console. And the Wallaby test console is interactive, so it's got some hyperlinks that you can use. And a couple of extra options at the top that we'll talk about later in the presentation. But you can see how many tests are passing, and you can quickly navigate to the tests that are failing. You'll see that we also have a couple of, in the case of the errors, we also have the stack trace reported for those errors, and you can go directly to those lines of code that have the problem. So if I control click on the test name, it will take me to the test that's failing. So it should find minimum number, and we've got a not implemented error. Okay, so we've got this error message Wallaby is adding to your editor. You'll also see that these glyphs in the margin are a little bit different as well. So Wallaby's added those glyphs for you as well. And so each of these colors means something special. So the green indicator means that your particular line of code has been covered by your test and it wasn't associated with any error. A red indicator means that this particular line of code is an error. So in the case of a test, it means this test is failing. In the case of an expectation, it means that my expectation is failing. You see, we have a lighter colored pink indicator. That lighter color means that this particular line is on the path of a failure. So it's not actually failing itself, but it's on the path of a failure. You can see we have a white color as well. And a white color means that this particular line of code didn't execute. And we have a yellow color, and the yellow color means that part of the line of code executed, but part of the line of code did not. So perhaps in this particular example, this first section of the if statement executed, but the second section of the if statement did not. So we're going to have a quick look at what Wallaby does when we fix a test. So here we should add numbers, and we have 2 + 2, and we're expecting 2 + 2 to be 5. So we've got a bug in our test, so we can fix that. You can see Wallaby ran immediately as I was typing, and the indicator's updated to show that everything is now passing, and the console down the bottom has also updated to say we now have 8 passing tests and 1 failing test. Similarly, if I wanted to fix this particular error, the not implemented exception, I can go to my stack trace. So I can see from the stack trace, we start at calculator spec and then it goes into calculator. So let's go straight to the calculator class. Okay, so we have a minimum function and it's not implemented. If I uncomment my return statement, you can see the white indicator again shows the error isn't actually being executed at all because we're returning straight away. And we're showing that this was partially executed, which probably means that we're testing where A is greater than B or where A is less than B, but not the other way around. If I go back to my calculator spec, we can see, first of all, down the bottom in the test console, everything is passing. And now if we go down to our minimum function, we can see that that's passing as well. So that's really brief. I don't want to spend too much time going through the basics of Wallaby. That's a really brief overview of Wallaby. What I would like to show you is also the same project in WebStorm. Excuse my zoom settings. It's a little bit hard to change the default zoom in WebStorm. But this is exactly the same project in WebStorm. But getting started in WebStorm is a little bit different. So WebStorm has got an option called run configurations. And what you need to do is you need to configure a new run configuration to run Wallaby. And this is WebStorm's way of running external programs that are running in the background. So to add a new run configuration, we're going to click the plus button and scroll down to Wallaby.js, and we might just rename this. You can keep it unnamed if you wanted to, but we'll rename it to Wallaby.js. And you don't have to do anything else, as I said, for 70 to 80% of project types. So all you have to do is click OK. And the final thing you have to do is run Wallaby. And you can see there's a shortcut for that, Shift F10, but we're going to run Wallaby, and you'll see a very similar thing. You will see, actually, we're installing Wallaby in the background because this is the first time that Wallaby's run in WebStorm since we had an update. And you can see it's running our tests. We have 9 passing tests. So you see a very similar view to what you see in VS Code. The only real difference is we do things in a more WebStorm-centric way based on the capabilities of WebStorm and the way that WebStorm presents information to developers compared to VS Code. And the same is true for other editors. I'm just going to pop up our website for a moment. So our docs are a really good way to get started if you're not familiar with Wallaby. So on the top of our website, on our homepage, there's a docs section. And the docs are pretty comprehensive, but we have a tutorial section. And for each of the editors, there's a tutorial on how to use that particular editor. We also have some tutorials for various popular UI frameworks. If you're using any of these UI frameworks, we have our previous webinar that we ran. There's a video that you can watch, and we'll update with this video as well. So there's a lot of material on the website, step-by-step tutorials, so that you can, let's say, pick your editor, go through how to start Wallaby for a particular testing framework and how things work and how things look. So recommend that you check those out if you're new to Wallaby. And as I said at the beginning of the presentation, please ask questions along the way, and we'll respond in real time. All right, how does Wallaby work? Well, it's magic. No, really, there's a lot of work that's been done behind the scenes over quite a number of years. So at a really high level, what happens when you start Wallaby is we start a new Node.js process that talks between the editor and between Wallaby's, what we call our server process. And that's responsible for maintaining your application state. So knowing about what tests exist in your project, knowing about the current code coverage state, knowing about which tests are associated with which parts of your application code. It's also responsible for distributing work to worker processes that it creates. And those worker processes that it creates will actually go and run your tests. And they run your tests in an isolated sandboxed environment, which means that we can execute your tests in isolation without having to worry about things breaking between different processes and whatnot. And we also we have some special code that we've written that allows us to reuse worker processes when possible. And it's possible, I would say, for 99% of projects. There's only a small number of projects where Wallaby can't reuse worker processes. And that really speeds up subsequent executions when you're using Wallaby. So when you've loaded an external dependency, some sort of node module, when we're running your test for the second time, that node module is already loaded, it's already in memory. So the test execution times as you're typing are really very incremental in terms of what work has to happen, what modules have to get loaded. It's just rerunning that test code that you might have changed, or your application code that you might have changed. And that's one of the key things that makes Wallaby so fast. And all of the communication that happened between the editor and the server process and the worker process happened by a combination of standard out, standard error, and WebSockets. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up a different project and take you guys through some of the main features of Wallaby. You can see we've got a couple of new items. So if any of you did attend our last webinar, you're probably familiar with all of the other modules that we've already shown, but there are a couple of new ones, Test Profiler and Output Inspector in particular, that we'll be covering today. So I'm going to go into a different feature demo VS Code project. And let's just have a quick look at the configuration. So this project is also using Jest, but you can see it's got a couple of other dependencies. It's using TypeScript, it's using Babel. If we have a look at the Jest configuration, it's pretty simple. Again, it's just using Node. And for Babel, we're actually applying a Babel TypeScript transform to convert our TypeScript instead of the TypeScript compiler and default Babel presets. So I'm going to start Wallaby on this project. Just like before, we have our Wallaby status indicator down in the bottom. If I click on this, I can bring up the Wallaby test console. I should point out as well that there are two consoles that Wallaby provides. Wallaby provides the test console, which is what we expect people to see and use often. But if you've got some sort of problem with your test, there's also the Wallaby.js console, which is more of a dump of everything that's happening as Wallaby's executing your code. And it includes some additional diagnostic information. So if you're having some sort of problem, you might want to check out the Wallaby console, but for the most part, it probably shouldn't be necessary. So what you see at the top of the test console is launch coverage and test explorer link. If I click that link, what you will see is you will see all of, by default, all of the tests that exist in your project. You have a number of filter options for these tests. So for example, you could say, I would only like to see failed tests right now. Wallaby allows you to add some logging, or you could accidentally add some console logs to your code. Wallaby also allows you to view any tests that have logs in them. In this case, we don't have any. View any tests that have been marked as a to-do. And you can also, in here, you could say, I'd like to preview this code, and you can see the code in the Wallaby app. Or you can click on this link here, locate in editor. And if I click on actually, I might bring my editor side by side. Whoops. Sorry. If I click the locate in editor button, you can see by clicking that Wallaby app, we've gone and opened up the file in the editor. So quite often, as a team, our workflow for using Wallaby app is we'll have VS Code perhaps open on one screen and Wallaby app open on another screen for people in our team who have a dual screen setup. You can also, I'm just going to maximize this again. You can also find all tests that are slower than a particular time. So if your tests are taking a long time to run, I might say, show me all tests that are slower than 5 milliseconds. And I might choose to focus on and improve those tests because I know there's an underlying performance issue that I need to resolve. You can also search for a test if you want. So if I search for all tests that have the word car in them, you can see we've highlighted all the specs and all of the test names with car in them. And there's also the files tab up the top. So we've got a test tab and a files tab. The files tab provides a high level strategic view of the coverage for your project. So you can see that overall our project has 79% coverage right now. And I can click on a file and I can see this particular file has 100% coverage. So there's all green indicators on all of the lines of code that can execute. But if I have a file that has some ranges of my code that haven't been executed, then Wallaby will also highlight this red color is Wallaby highlighting those parts of your code that haven't been executed. And you can see the same indicators that you would see in the editor, the pinks and the whites, the greens, the oranges, they also come through to Wallaby app. So you can see the current state of the world in terms of your test executions. We're going to move on to our advanced logging now. So one of the things that Wallaby is really good at is, I'm going to just go to, I'll go to this guy. Sorry, we'll go to upcoming birthdays file. One of the things that Wallaby is really good at is showing you the runtime values of your code as you're in the editor right now. So for example, if I wanted to see, so Wallaby's run this code, it's run the test for this code. If I want to see what is the value of employees, or what I can do is I can say console.log employees, and Wallaby will output the value of that employees variable. I can also go to the Wallaby tools section of my editor. And if you can see we've got the Value Explorer section. In Value Explorer, I can expand this node, and I can see I have an array with 5 elements. You can see there's a bit of context provided. It says upcoming birthday test should return. So I have a little bit of context of what file, what line of code, what the associated test is. And I can expand the items here and start to explore the data. And the Value Explorer also allows you to do some other things. So I could, for example, right click and say, copy the data. I want to copy all of this data to my clipboard because I want to take it somewhere and do something with it. Wallaby also applies some additional smarts. So I might, for example, I'm just going to refactor my code a little bit. I'm going to call this employee's promise. And I'll say wait, employee's promise. Wallaby also allows you to log things like promises. So I'm going to, here you've seen I've used console log. Here I'm going to use another way of outputting values. I'm going to use the show value command. And if I show value, you'll see we've popped up our output inspector. So this is another way that you can view data. So we've got the data in the Value Explorer. I'm just going to close the Value Explorer for now. And we also have the same data displayed in our output inspector. And you see I logged a promise here. And because I logged a promise, Wallaby's added this then prefix to let us know that we've logged a promise. So it knows how to unwrap the promise and how to display that for us. If you were to simply outside of Wallaby say console log a promise, you're just going to get that a promise has been logged. You're not going to actually get the value. So Wallaby's doing that for you, and it does similar things with some other data types such as buffers. It will try and convert a buffer to a string if it's going to log that for you. So output inspector is one of those new features that we spoke about or that I mentioned in the previous slide. And what output inspector does is it shows the value. So you saw the Value Explorer before. If I just go back to it. So Value Explorer is really good at looking at data that you may not actually know the structure of. So you can kind of explore and say, well, what is it that I'm looking at? What is the shape of this data? If you were making an API call, for example, you weren't sure what the results were that you were going to get back, you might choose to use Value Explorer. But Output Inspector actually displays all of that information for you straight away. You can see I don't have to expand anything. Everything's here. And it provides some additional context as to where this was logged from. So you can see, okay, it was logged from upcoming birthday, line 4, which is over here on the left-hand side. And I have all of the values. But in addition to that, I also have a couple of extra options available to me. So I could, for example, say, well, go to the test that's associated with this particular value. So if I click on go to test, it's going to go to the test that this was logged from. I can also say go to the code. It will take me back to where this was logged from. I could say I want to reveal this in Value Explorer, which we already saw. So it's going to open up Value Explorer for you if you wanted to play around with it in a different way. And you could, if you wanted to, debug the test that's associated with this particular logged value. And we're going to have a look at debugging tests in an upcoming module. So we spoke about console log. We spoke about show value. Another way that you can log a value in Wallaby is simply by having an identifier expression. So simply by mentioning the variable name. So here, if I type employee, you'll see we're logging the value of employee. So that's another way that I can log a value. I can also, if I wanted to, log a value with a special comment. So I can have an inline comment, or I can have a comment at the end of the line. But I'm going to have an inline comment, and you simply put a question mark in that comment, and it will log the value of employee at every point for every employee that gets mentioned where that or gets executed where that comment exists. And again, more advanced, you're probably not going to do terribly often, but you can also operate on the object that's being logged. So in this case, I'm logging employee, which logs the entire value. You can see that in the output inspector, but I might not care so much about logging the entire value. All I care about is the name. And if that's all I care about, I can use this context variable and say, look, all I want is the name instead of the entire object. And here you can see it's changed, and all we're doing is logging the name. So if you're not familiar with this, the advanced logging features of Wallaby, it's a really easy way to see some runtime values to try and work out why tests might be failing or why your code is behaving in a particular way. Really suggest that you check that out. The last thing that we're going to do is we're going to move on to one of the more hidden advanced logging features, which is object proxy. And I'm going to open up a different file. I'm going to go to our car tests. So in this particular case, I may have a test that is failing. And I know that it's failing because something is calling my object that shouldn't be, but I don't know where it's calling it from, or something's mutating in this case, my car instance, and I don't know why. So what you can do, you can add the live comment command. And again, you'll see we've popped up the output inspector. And I should also note, if you don't like output inspector being popped up automatically when you add a live comment, you can change that. That's an option in the Wallaby VS Code settings. But to apply the object proxy, what I need to do is I need to add another question mark to the comment. And when I add another question mark, you'll see the object has changed a little bit. We've added this flag, and that flag indicates that it's a proxied object. Once I've proxied an object, again, I'm going to go back to Value Explorer in the Wallaby tools. Once I've proxied an object, you get an extra element that appears in the tree, accessed members. And access members shows all of the properties and methods that were called on this object in the order that they were called. And for any methods that return a value, you'll see the value that was returned at that point in time. And it works on both functions and properties. So in this particular case, if we say, all right, let's look at accelerate to, okay, so accelerate to, let's view the call stack. And I'm going to move this out a little bit. I might just close the output inspector. So this was called from carspec TS line 38 and carspec TS line 38. Okay, and that's the first call to car. So that kind of makes sense. If I was to look at something different, so speed, we set it to 88. Let's expand that and have a bit of a look and look at the call stack. Okay, so it's accelerate to on car TS line 36. And here we can see this is where it's getting set in the accelerate to method. So again, really helpful little feature to be aware of if you're trying to work out why is my code broken and what's mutating a particular variable or object. All right, we're going to move on now to our time travel debugger. And you probably saw before, I'm just going to undo, I'll undo all of these changes. You probably saw before that we had a broken test. So if I navigate to this test, you'll see I have an option to debug the test that appears up the top here. And I also have a code lens action to debug my test up the top here. So if I want to debug this test, all I have to do is click debug. There's also a command, so Shift F5 to start debugging a test. You don't have to use the code lens actions or click in the test console. So if I debug this test, Wallaby immediately turns into debug mode, and you can see we've got a debugger section that's been added in the Wallaby tools, and that's got a few things available to it. Wallaby's debugger is a little bit different from traditional debugger in that you can both step forward and backward through your code. So the orange indicators that you see up the top are all of our debug actions for stepping backward, and the blue indicators are all of the actions for stepping forward, which is the default, what you would be familiar with a debugger. You can also debug stop the debugger at any time. And for each one of those actions, there's a keyboard shortcut associated. So if you were debugging your code normally, you probably want to make yourself familiar with those keyboard shortcuts. But in this case, just to begin with, I'm going to just step into, and the same actions actually exist over here as well if you want to use them from over here. So I'm going to step into to see what's going on with this test and why is it breaking. All right, so I have a constructor. All of this looks fairly innocuous. I can step forward, but I can also step out if I wanted to. So just Shift F11, step out. And let's go into this guy and see what's going on. Okay, so there's a method that says if the speed is greater than or equal to 88, I'm going to do something, but it looks like it was a brand new instance, so the speed's going to be 0. And then we're going to accelerate the car. And so we're saying if the speed is greater than or equal to 88, we're going to accelerate. And if I come in here, okay, if the speed is greater than 88, okay, so I've just stepped forward. I'm going to go backward now. So I'm going to step back into, and I'll keep going. So I've spotted my bug. This should be greater than or equal to 88, and it's actually greater than 88. And you can see Wallaby knows that this is on the path to an error. And if I change this to an equal, you can see Wallaby started passing this test, and this code is executed. And I can step forward now, and I can see we've executed the code that we expected, and our expectation is now correct. The other thing that you can do, so if I go into this accelerate to, I might say, look, I want to run back to this particular line of code by clicking the run back to current line button. So you can quickly navigate to parts of your code just like you would with a debugger. You can also set debug breakpoints in VS Code and work with the debug breakpoints and the Wallaby time travel debugger. The one thing to be aware of is if you have a glyph in your margin, it's a current VS Code bug or limitation that doesn't allow you to also apply a debug point. So you can use the F9 hotkey, which is the add debug breakpoint, and add a breakpoint, but you can't use the mouse in the side of the editor margin. The other thing you can do with the time travel debugger is when Wallaby is in this mode, all you have to do is select a variable or a parameter, and Wallaby will show the runtime value of that variable or parameter. So if I select the speed, you can see the speed that was passed in to this function is 88. I can also select this if you like, and it's going to log the entire car. And similarly, you're seeing the value output in Value Explorer if you wanted to see what see in more detail what those values were, or explore them, explore nested values. So Wallaby Debugger, this feature has been around now for a little over a year or a year and a half. And since using it, I didn't mention, but we use all of Wallaby products internally for our day-to-day development. And since we added the time travel debugger, we're using it almost every day. So we think it's a really helpful feature. Again, if you're not familiar with it, definitely worth checking out. Okay, the next thing I'm going to have a look at is Wallaby's test story viewer, and I'm going to provide a little bit of context on the test story viewer before we dive into it. So I want to go after we released the time travel debugger. We'd had a number of niggling conversations about how it's sometimes hard to understand what a test is doing in the context of fixing a bug. So quite often you may not be familiar with a particular piece of code, and you're expected to fix a problem, and you don't even know what the code is doing. And we thought, well, one of the key problems is the way that your code is structured is good for writing new code. It's good for writing maintainable code. It's good for writing testable code, but it's not necessarily ideal for understanding what code is doing. So we created this concept of a test story. And what a test story does is, in the context of running your tests, it captures all of the code that was executed by Wallaby so that you can see what the code actually did. And again, you'll see that we've got the code lens actions available to you, but you can also run a command for this. But if I click view story for this particular test, what you'll see I'm going to get rid of some. What you'll see is Wallaby shows you all of the code that was executed from start to finish, step by step. And some of that code is dimmed, and where the code is dimmed, that's Wallaby just providing some additional code so that you've got some context as to what this thing was doing. So when the testing framework, in this particular case, Jest, runs your test, it's running some describes, even though it's not necessarily executing them. It's running all of the tests that you've defined, so all of the methods that you've described, even though you may not be using them. And then it starts to run your code. And you'll see up the top, the time travel debugger is actually available in the context of running a test story. And as we change between files, you'll see, so we started with our car spec, and then we've gone into our car, and then we go back into our car spec. So Wallaby is showing you as we're switching between files, and this gives you a top-down. These are the lines of code that executed that did something while I was running this test. So if you're unfamiliar with a particular piece of code, this is also a pretty helpful thing to be able to use. And you can, as I said, use the same debugger action. So if I say run forward to this active line, so it's run down to here, and you can see we've synchronized in the other pane the code editor, so that you can actually go and edit this code if you want to. So this code that you see, the test story, is all read-only, but if you wanted to edit the code, you can actually do the same. You can edit it over here. But the intention is more that you're going to use the test story for understanding what something is doing, more than editing code, but you can, of course, edit along the way if you want to, and the test story will show those changes updated in real time. Okay, finally, we're going to have a quick look at one of our new features for 2021, Test Profiler. And what Test Profiler allows you to do is to run a test and to get the CPU profile, the Node.js CPU profile, or browser CPU profile for when that particular test was run. So if I click on the profile button, in the case of VS Code, I can choose to open the profile in VS Code, or I can choose to open the profile in Chrome DevTools. For other editors, they don't allow you to open a profile in the editor, so you only have the option to open in Chrome DevTools, or no options provided at all. It just opens in Chrome DevTools for you. But in this particular case, we're going to open the profile in the Chrome DevTools, and Wallaby has rerun your test. It's profiled that test, and it has displayed the CPU profile in Chrome. And what I can do if I wanted to see, okay, what's taking all the time? Okay, I've got a run internal method that's calling Jasmine and a whole bunch of required. I don't know where all this code is and what it's doing. So you can see there's a little pop-up, and it tells you that this is Jest runtime build index.js line 692. It's a little bit small, maybe you can't see that. But if I click in the Chrome DevTools on this particular line of code, or this this highlighted box, Wallaby will go and open that code in VS Code for you to inspect and have a look at and see what's going on. For these particular tests that I have, there aren't any performance issues. So there's all of the code that you're going to see here, or all of the time, is really testing framework time, and it's all to be expected. Normally, you wouldn't see that a single test is going to take 180 milliseconds to execute, but in this particular case, the CPU profiling adds a little bit of overhead as well to what we're doing. So when we added this feature, we kind of had an intuition that people would find this useful. We'd had people ask us to be able to do this before, and then we started to apply it to the Wallaby code base. And in the first week or so, we identified a number of pretty major improvements that we were able to make simply by having this available to us. So again, if you've got a more complex application, obviously what Wallaby is doing, there's a lot of work that it does behind the scenes in terms of instrumenting your code and tracking changes and everything else. So you may not have the same thing for a simpler, let's say, web-based application, but you may find that useful as well. And it's a great new feature that that you can start using. All right, I'm going to move on now and talk a little bit about how to maximize your productivity when using Wallaby. And to start with, we're going to have a look at what it's like to work on large projects and some of the options that we have available to make that easier for you. So I'm going to go back to my same project. I'm actually going to stop Wallaby. So what you can do on a large project, you may have hundreds of tests, thousands of tests, and you're working on a particular component or a particular module, and you know that you only need to run the test for that module. So if you have structured your code under a set of folders for that module, you could, for example, right-click on a folder and say, start a Wallaby exclusive test run for this folder. And that would tell Wallaby just to run the tests for that specific folder. You can also select a particular file. So you could say, I want to simply run on the upcoming birthday spec. And so I say start exclusive test run on upcoming birthdays. You can see Wallaby's running down the bottom. And if I click on the console, there's only one test and it's only executed the upcoming birthday spec. So if I was to go to, let's have a look at the car, you can see there's no code that has been executed in my car file. But I could, if I wanted to, say, all right, well, actually, I also want to run the tests for the car spec. And if I run the test there, you'll see that the indicators change. So that's a really quick and easy way to work in a large project. Only select the file or the test, the folder or the spec file that you want to actually work with. And I'm going to restart Wallaby so that it's running everything for us now. And I'm going to open up our spec file to the side. The next handy little feature for working on a large project is to focus or filter a test. So what that means is, by default, all of the code coverage indicators that you're seeing and any of the errors that are displayed in line or any of the messages that are displayed in line are for all of the tests in your project. So you may be working on a specific test and it's creating a little bit of noise. You can't really understand what the indicators mean in the context of your test, what code was executed, what code was not. And so what you could do is you can say, look, I want to focus on just this test. If I focus on this test, you can see over on the left-hand side, this indicator changed because this particular test doesn't actually call that code. So if I again remove from filter and I will focus again, you see that the indicators have changed. And the same is true for the inline values. Similarly, I can add additional tests. So if I had a suite of tests that I wanted to focus on at the same time, I can click on the focus button and you see again, the indicators have changed. So Wallaby has merged all of the indicators and all of the information that's displayed to you in the editor. So all that's happening is when you use these remove from filter, Wallaby's changing the indicators that it displays in the editor. So it's allowing you just to focus on that single test. The other thing that you can do is if you have a large project with lots of tests and you need to quickly navigate to another test, you can use Wallaby, and I'll just say search tests. So if you use the Wallaby search test command, it'll pop up all of the tests that are filtered, that can be filtered. So if I want to say, show me everything where there was a birthday, so I can quickly filter the birthday test and I can click on this item or just press enter and it will take me straight to that test. So again, working on a large project with lots of tests, that's another really helpful command. You also have available to you the built-in, your testing framework's built-in test filtering. So a lot of testing frameworks support, say, a dot only. So if I use dot only after a test, your testing framework is only going to run this one test. So you can use that as well if you don't want to use Wallaby's exclusive test run. Obviously, you're modifying your code to get that result. One thing to be aware of is if you're using dot only versus focus or the add to exclusive test run, the minute that you remove that, Wallaby has to try and run all of the tests in your project because it doesn't know, it loses its relationship between your application code and your tests. So it doesn't know exactly what to re-execute because things may have changed in your project. So that's one thing to be aware of if you're using the testing framework specific options. Wallaby also has its own built-in comment that you can add. You can add this comment anywhere in your file. You can do file.only, and that tells Wallaby only execute the test in this file. So that's another little handy feature. And I should say all of these things are also documented on the website. We're just trying to make it easier for you to run through some of these things in our webinar today. In a larger project, we have this problem ourselves. You may find that you have a number of tests and a number of different types of tests. So you may have some end-to-end tests, you may have some integration tests, you may have some unit tests, and perhaps Wallaby can't run your end-to-end tests because you're using some other end-to-end testing framework. But certainly for your integration tests and your unit tests, you may want to separate those and not run your integration tests during your normal development. So you might want your CI server, for example, to run your integration tests. And to get around, or not to get around that problem, but our recommendation is to create separate Wallaby configuration files. So we ourselves have a Wallaby unit test configuration that's selected by default, and a Wallaby integration test configuration. And when we're running our test, usually we're not going to run the Wallaby integration test configuration unless we're working with an integration test or debugging a problem with an integration test. We'll normally just run the unit tests. So if you're working on a large project with lots of tests, try and break them up if it makes sense to, slow running, fast running, so that you can get the most out of your development. And finally, the other thing that may be pertinent working in a larger project is Wallaby supports a run on save mode. So if I go and turn off autosave on my project, I can say I want to change Wallaby to run on save. So make the Wallaby current session run only on save. So if I press enter, so Wallaby now is not going to run unless I save my file. So this might be helpful if you're making a large number of changes, or if your workflow is, I don't want Wallaby to run until I've finished, and then I'll save my file, and then Wallaby will run. So here, if I press enter, you see Wallaby's margin indicators and code lens, everything, all the inline value displays, everything has disappeared because they could be out of date. And when you save the file, Control S, Wallaby will go and run everything and put that back for you. You can also, if you want to, obviously you've got to have the autosave turned off in your editor, or it's not really going to have any effect. But you can also change the default startup behavior of Wallaby. So if you're working on a project where you don't want Wallaby to run until you hit save, or that's your workflow, then you could go and change Wallaby's default via a configuration. All right, so we had a look at working on large projects. Let's move on to improving code coverage with Wallaby. So we saw the Wallaby app before, and we saw the file section. So we come back to the file section. This is really where you're going to focus if you're looking to improve code coverage for your application. So to begin with, you've got that overall indicator that kind of tells you how things are looking, but you can also see quite quickly and easily, all right, there are this is the file that I might have less coverage than everything else. And again, by selecting on the file, you can see the sections of your code that aren't covered. In this particular case, it probably should be covered, but you may have code that really you don't want covered. So for example, we have in a lot of our server-side code, we have sections of our code that might try and catch, and we're in our catch block, we'll log the error and we'll rethrow the error. And in that particular case, we're not writing tests for the throw catch or the catch part of our logic because it's simple and kind of boilerplate, and we don't need explicit tests for those. But that decreases our overall code coverage and really doesn't give us a great feel for how our code coverage is tracking in terms of the things that matter to us. So what Wallaby allows you to do is you can, for example, let's just restart Wallaby so it's running on our entire project. And let's go back to that part of our code that wasn't covered. You can add a hint to Wallaby to tell it to ignore coverage of a particular branch. So you can see the indicators disappeared when I finish typing ignore coverage. And so what this is saying is, by having this comment here, it's associated with the next part of our code. And the next part of our code is the if statement and its consequent and subsequent branches. And here we're saying, don't instrument this code at all. And so the indicators have been removed, and we're not including this as part of our code coverage calculations. It also has some side effects. It means that the time travel debugger isn't going to work in this particular block of code anymore. So you really only want to apply it where you absolutely have to. But if I was to go back to back to our Wallaby app now and have a look, we've now got 100% code coverage. But this particular part, these ranges in this method aren't included at all in that code coverage. If I wanted to, I could be a little bit more granular and say, look, I only want to have it in these sections of our code. And again, you can see Wallaby's updated there. And you can also ignore coverage for an entire file. And I believe ignore file coverage is the command. And now you'll see that there's no coverage at all on that file. So we ourselves use the ignore file coverage for some of our own code if we want to make our code coverage percentage, if you like, important enough so that we can track what it's doing over time. So you might want to check that out. And if you are using those comments, you could go and apply the same hints to your CI server and how it is also calculating code coverage so that it's excluding calculating on those branches. And if you have existing hints that you've applied for your CI server for code coverage, you can also rename the Wallaby hints as well to align with your CI server. Navigation with Wallaby shortcuts. So I'm gonna do these next two together and then move on to snapshot testing. So Wallaby has a number of different commands available. So if I just search in VS Code, and the same is true for other editors, it's not specific to VS Code. And you see for some of these commands, we've already applied some default shortcuts. We'd recommend trying to be familiar with each of the default shortcuts that we've got in here, because these are going to be commands that you use often to be more productive when you're using Wallaby. What we kind of say to people is maybe every time you know you're going to be using Wallaby for more than 30 minutes or 60 minutes, take the time just to learn an extra command. There aren't that many of them. And by the time you've, I said there aren't that many of them, there are a few, but many of them you're not necessarily going to use day to day. But for the ones where we have keyboard shortcuts, if you learn one of those every day, in maybe 10, 15 days, you'll know them all, and you'll start to be a lot more productive using Wallaby. The other thing to be aware of in VS Code is, I'm just going to undo our fixes again, is we actually output problems to the problems view. So if you have a lot of failing tests, you can use VS Code's, I just click on this guy here. So I can click on the problem straight away to go to it, or I can click on the detail line to go to exactly where the error occurred. So you see we've got the test up the top, and we have the error or the line of code that failed down the bottom. VS Code also has a go to next problem command. So F8. So if I had multiple problems in here, maybe if I break something else, is that going to break? What do I need to do? Okay, let's break this one. Here we go. Am I going to break it? I'm not going to stuff around trying to break it. But if you had multiple problems in here, you can just press F8, 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 and you can skip between those problems. So that problems view for VS Code is also really handy. Now, finally, I'm just going to move on to snapshot testing. So Wallaby supports a number of different testing frameworks that have snapshot testing. If you're familiar with snapshot testing, what you need to do, simply use it as you would as per your existing testing framework. So if in the case of, I wanted to make sure that the car matches my snapshot. So what's happening here for people who may not be familiar with snapshots is our testing framework is saying, I'm going to grab the value of the car at this point, and I'm going to serialize out to disk what the car object looks like. And the next time I run the test, I'm going to make sure that the object still looks the same. So in this particular case, this is what the car looked like at that point. One of the problems that we have in this particular case is the current date changes every single time the test runs. And so the snapshot is always going to fail because the data is changing in this particular case. But I can update my snapshot, and Wallaby will update the snapshot over here. And obviously, as I said, the date changes every time we run a test. So if I change my test, the snapshot's going to fail again, but normally that's not the case. It's a good example of where you might use snapshots. Where we use in our application is we send out a number of emails to people with license keys and so forth. And we will visually manually check that the emails look the way that they should. And then we might snapshot the content of that email and for a given set of parameters. And if that changes unexpectedly, we're going to be made aware of that because the snapshot has failed. But Wallaby will update those snapshots in the background and also tell you when snapshots are obsolete, and you can go and update your snapshots and remove the obsolete ones if you wanted to. So that's a pretty little powerful feature if you're already familiar with snapshots. All right, I think we've covered all of the main features now. How to stay up to date with changes. So one of the things that we added recently, both for Wallaby and Quokka in VS Code, is our Wallaby start page. So Wallaby start page, you can click just down the bottom in your toolbar, and if you don't like that option being available to you, you can disable that as well, so you don't see Wallaby down there. We have a what's new section that we update. And from time to time, when we release major new features, we'll batch it up so that you're not getting too much noise. But from time to time, we'll update this. And the next time you start Wallaby, it will show the what's new if there's something, a big new feature available that we want you to be aware of. And you can disable that behavior if you want to by choosing not to be notified about new features up the top here. Also allows you to do some other things like manage your license and apply some different settings. But that's an easy way for you guys to be made aware of new changes if you're using VS Code. We also have on our website a what's new page. So at the top of our website, we have a what's new section. So if you click on what's new, you can see a more granular list of changes that have been made. And we try and keep this updated every couple of weeks or so. Finally, you can subscribe to our Twitter and to our mailing list. So those options are both provided on our website. So if you want to subscribe to our Twitter and to our mailing list, we'll tweet periodically when we're doing some important things, as well as other updates. And our mailing list is also available on the website, where we send out some newsletters from time to time. I know we're getting tight on time, and we allocated an hour, so some people may need to go. I'm going to give a very brief demonstration on Quokka before we wrap up. I also wanted to know if anyone does have to disconnect and wants to ask some questions later. I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit. We do have a Discord chat. So if you'd like to join us afterwards, ask any questions, join us on Discord. Artem and I will both be around for the next couple of hours to answer any questions you might have. But I'm going to go back and just quickly show you Quokka before we wrap up for question and answers. So I'm going to stop Wallaby here. And so Quokka is our other extension, similar to Wallaby. It's built on the same underlying core framework and architecture that we have for Wallaby. It's a little bit different. While Wallaby runs your tests, Quokka is simply running a single code file. So it's great for experimentation. It's great for prototyping. If I go into my commands for VS Code, I can say start a new JavaScript file, and I might say create a new date. And unlike Wallaby, if I want to output the value of this date, all I have to do in Quokka, at least if I'm using Quokka Pro, is select the value, and I will see the value displayed in my editor. I have the same output options available to me. Just like I use live comments in Wallaby, I can do the same thing in Quokka. I have the same contexts available to me if I wanted to. So I could say, I know that this is a date object. I could say get time on date, and it's going to apply the get time method on date. As I have the same proxy available to me. So a lot of the concepts that you'd already be familiar with in Wallaby apply to Quokka. One of the nice things that Quokka also provides is a set of interactive examples. So if I say Quokka.js, instead of saying new JavaScript file, I say new file. There are quite a range of examples that you can open if you're not familiar with something, or if you just need a little bit of a hint or some additional context for what you're working on right now. So I might, for example, be a little bit confused about how array slice works. So if I look at array slice, I can open an example and I could start to experiment and see what the runtime example, what runtime values of each of the slice methods happen to be. For Quokka, it doesn't have any configuration. It runs purely in Node. So if you're doing any sort of experimentation from time to time, Quokka is pretty helpful. We've got a community edition, which is completely free for everyone. And we have a pro edition that provides some more advanced features, such as project imports and live value display, as opposed to using things like console log. But all of that's detailed on the quokka.js.com website. So check that out if you're interested, if you're not already familiar with Quokka.